Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, to wherever you are. Talking today to Don Weatherbee from Regenexx, and we're going to get all into that in a second. We're going to be talking about precious metals, which is something we've never spoken about on the show before. And to be fair, I don't even know exactly what they are, and we're going to get to that too. I'm probably going to ask what feels like a lot of silly questions today, but I feel like I thought about this coming into the show, actually. I get to ask the silly questions so you don't have to, but then we all get to learn as a result, which is wonderful. So, Don, before we dive into Regenexx and precious metals and everything we're going to talk about, I'm actually just introduce yourself firstly, but I'm also curious as how you arrived even to be working on this problem in the first place, and then we'll dive straight in.
Sure. So I'm an accountant by trade. I had an accounting background, and I started working for mining companies out of university, first in coal, and then I moved into oil sands. And then as a change, I went through that, got hired by Regenexx. And Regenexx was was really a junior mining type company, one of those companies that goes around, digs holes in the ground, looking for resources and that sort of thing. And that was what we were going to. And then we had an opportunity to say, the economics aren't that great in just digging holes. What could we do? And so we looked into a technology bent, which was a processing technology. And so I started in 2015 with them, and I've always been more of an operations accountant than a backroom one. So as natural being involved with the operations, I just grew into the role of the CEO when the current one retired earlier this year.
That's a very unusual pathway in. Most people, I had this flash of, inspiration and whatever yours. I worked for a company and they weren't doing the right thing, and I was sort of in the background part of that. And then I was like, you know what? Maybe I should step into the foreground. Really, really interesting pathway into it. And you talked just before, and we will get to the detail of the technology, but it sounds like Regenexx saw an opportunity because you came across some technology. Just help me understand that little part of that equation.
Sure. So instead, we were the traditional junior explorer. And when we sold the property, we had the money and thought, how do we reinvest this? How do we maximize value? And we were presented an opportunity to look at a technology that was a material processing technology. And it was it was mobile, and it had the opportunity to recycle water. So the concept of it was to go into old gold mining operations and reprocess the tailings. Because what wasn't economic, 50, 100 years ago, you could be running back through and get more returns from it, especially in areas where water sources weren't plentiful. So that was the genesis of the idea. But the kernel of it is how do you process material? And that was what the technology was.
Wonderful. Good one. Okay. Well, we will definitely get into the technology a little bit later on, but we'll come straight back up to kind of the core of what we're going to talk about today, which is precious metals. And I firstly want to just put us in the zone with precious metals, because it's a term some people probably have heard of. I want to understand what precious metals are compared to critical minerals, which I think is getting a lot more airplay, but maybe they're the same thing. So let's just firstly get some terminology, and then we'll talk about the problems and challenges.
Sure. So precious metals is a general classification for your metals that have value and really have large amounts of value. And they're your golds, your silvers, your platinum, palladiums, those type of metals. So our company, we're focused in on what's called PGMs, platinum group metals. And so they're a little grouping of metals that are on the periodic table. And the most common ones are platinum, palladium, and rhodium.
Got it. And what is it that in the context of gold, people like to store a value, and silver's kind of the poor cousin, although I understand it's doing okay now as well. But if you look at these PGMs, I think you just called them, Like what is it? These have some kind of desirability to them in terms of, someone wants a platinum ring, but they have uses beyond this, which I think is really the focus today. Help me understand how these metals are used.
Sure. So what makes these ones special is that they're oxidizers, and and they're also conductors. And that's a lot of these precious metals, even the gold and silver. What makes them really special in the sort of information economy is that they conduct very well. So they can transmit electropulses very well. And so they are used in a lot of chips and different computers and electronics and all those pieces where you need things that are good conductors.
Right.
Also, they're oxidizers, which is where their primary use for platinum and palladium right now is in catalytic converters. And what it does is it creates a chemical reaction that knocks out the smog gases and the carbon monoxide out of exhaust fumes.
Got it. Okay, cool. So basically these metals have a range of kind of applicability, but very specifically, and this is interesting because if you go to Regenexx and kind of have a look at it, you've kind of narrowed in onto catalytic converters as a very specific group. And this in and of itself is a huge market. So I want to come back to that in a second, but I just want to understand a little bit about the kind of the supply side for getting these metals if you weren't trying to recover them, because you're obviously focused on the recovery side, but right up front you were like, well, but digging these things up is actually not very viable. So help me understand what that looks like and maybe how that's changed in the last few decades.
Sure. So currently, the major producers of platinum and palladium are South Africa and Russia. So they have a bunch of geopolitical issues around both of those supply chains. Russia in its international reputation, South Africa with its infrastructure issues, power, all those types of things that make expansion in those areas difficult. Also, PGMs are one of the most rare metals in the Earth's crust. So it's not like there's vast untapped deposits of these metals that are available to go after.
Right. And so economically, is it getting to the point where, 100 years ago, you'd put a pick in the ground and a whole bunch of oil would shoot up and now you have to go digging for it or pulling it out of tar sands? Are we in a similar place with PGM?
I would say so, not critically, but yes, you're getting there. You can't count on future supply to come from new holes that you dig.
Right. And is there a understanding of, like, I think in oil there's some, and although the number changes depending on who within the industry you're talking to, there's an understanding, well, we've dug this much up and there's still this much in the ground that we're aware of. Do you have a similar understanding with these metals?
I don't have those specific details. It's not a large number, but mine's not going to go away in the near term.
Got it.
I mean, there's decades left of mining,
sure.
But there's growth in these demands too. That's
yeah. Well, I guess this was going to be my question, right? Because the center of all of this is, are we at a tipping point where we're not going to be able to sustain the demand side with simply digging this stuff up? We will have to try to find it from places we've already pulled it out and put it into some machine.
Well, we're pretty much already there.
Right.
One of the numbers I do know is that on average, over the last 8 years, there's been a deficit in supply of 259,000 ounces of PGM, of platinum and palladium. So we're already in deficit supplies. And so some of that gets made up by stockpiles. Some of it gets made by turning investment grade stuff to commercial grade. Those types of factors hit the marketplaces.
I'm just going to go down that rabbit hole for a sec. So you've got a really lovely bit of palladium and you can essentially cut it up, to use a street term, to then make it commercial grade?
Well, what I'm saying grade is not changing the grade, but it's saying instead of you sitting with that platinum bar in your inventory, you decide that it's better for it to not sit as platinum and be turned into a commercial product.
Got it. Okay, so that's the shift from to commercial grade. So that's a super interesting idea. And if there is And by the way, I can't in my head understand what 229,000 ounces is. Is that tons, or like how many tons might that be, or is it? It's going to be. No, I don't have the exact number. I'm trying to understand the magnitude of it.
I try to do math in my head, and then you're stumping me here. But so there are. What is it? There's 31 grams in an ounce.
It looks like it's the tens of thousands is what we're looking at. Isn't it? Okay, good one. Tens of thousands a kilo. All right, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you've got an iPhone that needs some palladium, I don't know if an iPhone does, but we're talking about grams or points of a gram that's needed.
We'll flip it back to a catalytic converter. I mean, there's usually between 6 and 30 grams in a catalytic converter.
Right.
So it's a lot of product.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the numbers that you do have, which I find fascinating, is take that out of the precious metal and elevate that up to either the number of catalytic converters or the revenue opportunity and what that stuff's worth. Help me understand that, because that's really the economic opportunity here.
Yeah. So what you're looking at is platinum and palladium. They were out higher before, but currently are sitting in around $1,000 US an ounce.
Right.
And you're talking that the right now there's sort of looking at 11,000. There's 10 or 11 million ounces of use in a year.
Okay, huge. Billions of dollars.
Yeah.
20, $30 billion.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, and so this all then begs the question. It's hard to get this stuff out of the ground. We have a deficit. There's a huge financial opportunity. Why isn't much of it being recycled today? Help me understand that.
There's two things in it. So right now, about 30%, 35% of the current demand is filled by recycled sources in a year.
Okay, right.
So there is a substantial chunk being recycled, but it gets into understanding how it's recycled and capacity constraints on the recycling. So currently, the dominant recycling, commercial recycling, is done by melting the materials in a smelter. So smelters aren't exactly easy or cheap to build. And they're not, the regulations and that around getting a new smelter built. So there's not a lot of demand for those to come online. So where to increase some of this, it has to come from other sources than the current streams.
Another process. And just as a tangent to that is, like, anytime I hear the word smelter, all I think is a lot of heat and a lot of energy.
That's exactly it. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a problem here as well. Like, if you have a thing that's worth $1,000 an ounce and you're putting $200 or $300 worth of energy into the process to get that ounce out, you're instantly behind the eight ball. What's it kind of as a tangent to that? Because when I kind of look at, even before we get into exactly how your process works, I want to get to that in a sec. A lot of how you position the company and how you're thinking about this is you're pointing it from an environmental message. So there's an economic opportunity, and you do talk about that, but you're very kind of centric in this idea of, hey, there is an environmental imperative to be doing this process this way. Can you help me understand a bit more about the environmental impact of how it's done today, or of it not being done?
So there's what we look at is a few different streams where we see the environmental impact. Is that, first off, with only 30%, 35% being recycled, there's a huge waste of the material going right back into landfills,
right,
type thing, and getting wasted, and just a poor use of a scarce resource. Second side is comparing our process to mining itself and how intensive and not economically, but environmentally large footprint that is. There, where we're going, that we have a chance to get the same product with a much smaller footprint, astronomically smaller footprint than mining. And even when compared against the current recycling of smelting, that is an energy and every ton of feedstock they put in, they're creating about 1,500 kilograms of CO2. So, which naturally happens whenever you melt and burn something.
And just in terms of the mining part of it, if you say that a third of it's recycled today, 2/3 of it goes to waste, there's a whole shortfall. if you had the amount that is being supplied every year, how much of that is coming from new mining new source rather than recycling old?
Well, it's the 60%.
That's just okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, yeah. Okay. So the thing I guess I'm trying to understand is I'm trying to paint a picture of what the mining process looks like, because some mining, whilst it's intensive on the land, can actually be a very small footprint. We have open cut mines in Australia that are unbelievably full on in terms of their impact in the environment. Where does kind of these precious metals sit in terms of how they're mined?
It's a variability. It's the same as gold type thing. Some of it's underground and some of it's open pit. And that all depends on the resource and the reserve, on how it's laid down, where it sits, what's the economic best route to get to it. So you'll get the traditional pictures where you got the big hole, and you've got the mining shafts. Both of them are applicable.
Applicable here, yeah, understood. Interesting. I've never encountered any kind of palladium mine. I mean, I'm aware of gold mines. There's a large one in Kalgoorlie in Australia, but in terms my guess is that those types of mines are probably digging up gold, but also encountering some of these precious materials.
They are. Some of them are, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
More gold and silver come together. Right. Platinum and palladium are a little bit different pieces, but South Africa is a big gold producer too, and they're a big platinum producer. So
got it. Okay, wonderful. All right, so we have the setting. We have a thing that is in short supply. It's getting harder to mine, like anything that's a limited resource. There's a whole bunch of it that already exists in the world, and at least 2/3 of it's not getting recycled, despite the fact there's a huge economic opportunity. And then there's an environmental problem with all the stuff in the way that we're either mining it or recycling it as it works today. So beautifully set up. Help me understand now how the Regenexx process actually works then.
Sure. So we're what's called a hydrometallurgical process, really chemical leaching. And so we take the feedstock we get, and what our feedstock is used catalytic converters. And a catalytic converter, if people haven't seen it, it sort of looks like the muffler under the car. And in the muffler section here is that there is, in that canister, there is a honeycomb that's made up of either a ceramic or a silicon carbide structure. And this honeycomb is full of holes and full of little pieces, and the precious metal, platinum and palladium, are plated on the honeycomb. And the concept is that you want to have the most surfaces to touch the precious metal as the air flows through, to create as many of the reactions as possible as it goes through the catalytic converter. And so our partner, who's a large scrap dealer, takes and cuts open those canisters and then separates out the honeycomb and grinds it down into a fine powder for us. And we take that powder, we put it into a chemical leach, which then separates out the PGM from the base silicon carbide. And that silicon carbide, then we separate the now liquid that contains the precious metal, which we call a PLS, a pregnant leach solution. From those
a pregnant leach solution.
Pregnant leach solution.
Primo. I love that. I didn't think we'd be talking about pregnant leeches today, but we're there, so that's wonderful. Please continue.
So we separate out that liquid from the feedstock solids that still exist. And so now we have this liquid that has precious metals in it. We take it to another chemical process, traditionally called Merrill-Crowe, and then which drops the precious metals back into a solid form. And it leaves us with what's called a dirty concentrate, black powder. And with that black powder, that's exactly sort of the same type of material that comes out of a smelter. And so both us and the smelter then send it to an upgrader who takes all the impurities that are in there and converts it into what's called the 999 product, which is 99.9% pure metal.
Wonderful. That was beautifully laid out. I'm hoping there's a nice process map that actually does that. I have a range of questions, but I'm going to start with the question that sits right up front. And we're talking about in the context of catalytic converter, because I think the catalytic converter is interesting in that its usage isn't as a conductor. Its usage is because of the oxidization you talked about before. So when it's sitting in that honeycomb, its job has been to filter out things on the way through so they don't end up in the environment, carbon monoxide and the like, by virtue of being reactive to these things. Therefore, when you get it from the crushed honeycomb, it's not at that point the precious metal, it's not the palladium, but it's an oxidized version of that. Is that correct?
No. So some of it does oxidize on it, which causes them not to work as well. But what they're doing, because they're sitting there as the reagent, is that they're combining the air into new things. So they're allowing, as it comes through, your nitrogen oxides or your sulfur oxides to bond also with the carbon monoxides and turn it into CO2 and nitrogen type thing. So it's rearranging the chemicals that are coming through to make them less environmentally harmful than they were as they were coming in the front end. So precious metal just sort of sits there, and it's sort of like a playground for this to happen, and nothing really happens to it.
Interesting. Okay, so it's a reagent in the process rather than actually forming some new material as a result of its interaction with the elements that are present or the molecules that are present. My chemistry's a little rusty. It's fascinating.
I will also say is that if there's expert chemists listening to this, I am not a chemist. I play one on TV, and I try to simplify what our scientists tell me into bite-sized shapes that I can understand. Do I get everything right? Probably not, but I'm close.
Look, I think the main point remains is that the majority of the metal itself is actually not something that you need to apply a chemical process to specifically to rip stuff off it, like an oxidization. What you're doing is saying when you get this, it sounds like it's economically practical for them to just grush everything into one go and say, there's some silicon carbide in there and there's some palladium in there, you sort it out. And the point of that chemical reaction, that primary reaction that you're doing initially, is about separating the palladium and as much as possible from these other things, in this case, the silicon carbide.
Yeah, exactly.
Beautiful. And then just from an economic perspective, there's some chemistry that goes into this. Like, what are your inputs and what are your outputs at a chemistry level, therefore what, and at an economic level?
So we don't dive into our chemistry because that's our proprietary.
Sure,
that's our secret sauce.
Okay, good.
As we do it. So, and there is a wide range of chemistries that can do this, but it's a matter of how you're using your chemistry and all that part of the pieces type thing. So, so we put the chemistry in, separate it out, and then that's where we get what we have as outputs is our black powder, and we have a feedstock like a tailings, which is really the silicon carbide and anything left in it, and then some waste water that comes from once you take the metals out of that pregnant leach solution, you have some waste water, and the wastewater just needs a little bit of treatment, and then it can be released. And the tailings, we've got some opportunities for commercial applications for those tailings. And that's what we're working on with our partner, Davis, on how we commercialize those tailings.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, we spoke to the modern hydrogen guys, and they have a process that puts their chemical reaction in front of a gas peaker plant and turns the gas into a hydrogen for the gas peaker plant, but it strips out the carbon in the process and turns that into a feedstock for bitumen. And it makes a far better substrate for bitumen. And I'm like, guys, this is awesome. You've taken a thing that we don't like and turned into two things we do want, which are of higher value, either economically or environmentally. So I can absolutely see something. I guess the reason why I was asking it wasn't to get specifically to the chemistry, because I understood that would be the special sauce, secret sauce.
Yeah. So we have a little heat, but low heat.
Right.
So we heat our chemistry to about 90 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
So that's not that.
Boiling the kettle.
Yeah. And that's the part where we want to stop it. We don't want to boil.
Right. Interesting.
We want to get it. We just want to get the chemistry excited because it needs to be a little excited to do its job.
All I can imagine here is a whole bunch of like cool Regenexx t-shirts. Just want to get the chemistry excited. Don't let it boil. Just all these little teasers to the chemical reaction without actually spilling the beans. Just as an aside on that, is it patentable? Like, do you develop this technology and you put patents on it? How does that play for you?
We could. We haven't gone down that route yet, partly because we're doing some continuous improvement as we move along. And if you know any people with patents always understand a patent is a snapshot in time of right then, there, this is exactly what you do. And where we looked at the patent side is, one, the cost didn't justify at this point in time. And second, we didn't want to have to show our hands, because when you're talking chemistry, it's really easy to make a few changes and do and say you've done something different than what you've done. I mean, the whole trade secret route is as I was looking at it, and that is some couple interesting pieces on that. Some of the things that you would imagine are patented that aren't, like Intel's chip is a trade secret. Google's algorithm is a trade secret and not patented.
Yeah, Coca-Cola's the one that always comes to mind.
Yeah, Coca-Cola's the classic one. But
yeah, but you want to be in the echelon of trade secrets that no one still knows how it works. I reckon that's a good call.
And Porsche's engine isn't a patent.
Wow. How can you not deconstruct that? Like, it's physically there. You could look at it.
Yeah.
Interesting. My thought on this, by the way, is that some of these actually knowing how, like the moving parts and looking at it and going, all right, I can see a carburetor there. I know how it works. But if you don't know how to make the carburetor, right, if you don't know how to source the things that are required for it to be made, that's actually 3/4 of the battle. You know, and I think you talked about just before we got on the show in terms of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, is so much of this is learning how to execute the thing for which you have technically solved, but economically haven't worked out how to bring the pieces together to create kind of the outcome that is a business that's sustainable financially beyond that.
Yeah, and we also talk about on our technology, we had to solve 2 problems to make this work. We had to solve the chemistry problem, which is actually the simple one. But then there is the physics problem, the mechanical problem. Is because you're moving a lot of things from different stations to different stations, there's a lot of how you make that work efficiently is a whole other set of issues.
Are you talking about within the factory or the facility itself, or beyond the facility?
Yeah. Well, like I said, that when I talked I talked in general how we had 3 or 4 different stages there. Well, they're not all handled in the same container. And so when you've got materials that you need to flow from one stage to the other, all with different chemistries and different densities and those pieces, how you get it to move effectively and efficiently is a whole other set of issues that had to be solved.
Interesting. I imagine that, like, even if you had 2 vastly different substances that might be reactive with different types of metals, that you might need piping of one type in one area and piping of a different type in another, that kind of thing?
Exactly. And pumping. Pumping is one of the ones that in your small scale, your laboratory scale, all that, pumping's never an issue.
All right.
Because you can't get pumps small enough to be the same size as what you're running. Then when you go full scale, whether you have the right size of pumping is always a wait and see.
Interesting. And so going beyond the factory itself, I mean, there's kind of a process that sits around this, and you touched on it very lightly, which is we have a partner who has a scrapyard and they grind this stuff up and send it to us in bags. We didn't say bags, but presumably, it comes in probably on the back of a truck.
Super sacks, those white flexible bags. That's what we get it in.
That was a good guess on my part. I am curious though about like the logistics of this, and is this kind of why you thought, look, we'll start with catalytic converters because the process of getting the raw material is relatively well known in that context?
Yes, and I told you a little bit of the story of us up until getting this processing technology. So there's a little bit more of how we moved from there to catalytic converters, is that once we sort of started working with processing technologies, other people sort of noticed and started asking us if we could do some stuff in other spaces, which led us into e-waste first. And then while we were working in e-waste, our partner Davis Recycling approached us and said, can you do that with catalytic converters? I have this issue with this stream of catalytic converters. Can your process work on that? And that sent us down that path of investigating catalytic converters. And so it was him who led us to the specialty because he had a market that wasn't being served.
Interesting. And in some respects, more conducive to the process that you've got or the process you're developing.
Yeah. What we liked, comparing e-waste to catalytic converters are relatively homogeneous. Like they're pretty much what they are. When you're dealing with e-waste, there's all kinds of stuff on a board. And so you're always dealing with new and varied stuff. So it makes the processing it very hard because some of it has all kinds of these things and some have contaminants, and what you do with soft metals, what you do with precious metals, what you do with the junk, how you separate all that stuff. It's all adds a whole level of complexity that we kind of like catalytic converters not having.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, and the thing is, like, I hadn't considered catalytic converters as a source of precious metals before coming on the show, obviously, because I know nothing about the space. But what I'd always imagined is that I had known that these precious metals were used in electronics, and it was always like, well, there's a circuit board and there's 2 grams of it somewhere on that circuit board. You know, what's like, just to as a tangent for a second, I know you're not actively involved in this space, but like, how's someone getting 2 grams of palladium, maybe not the right metal, or platinum off a printed circuit board? Like, what's actually happening?
So a lot of it's done through smelters like that too, because they can just throw it all in and melt it. And, you know, different things melt at different points. So as you're going through it, sort of self-separates, but then the carbons and the garbage and that just burn up and turn to ash. So that's the easiest way to do e-waste, is in the smelting side of it. There are groups trying to do the chemical process, and it's all about bleaching. It just gets complicated on separation of, because for most leaches, it's funny to say, but if you look at the price of the metal, it's usually the easiest to leach. So like copper is the thing that a lot of leeches love first. Like they will eat up all the copper and leave everything else. So you have to keep adding leach to go past getting all the copper. I'll give one example as a funny for us was there shouldn't be that much copper in a catalytic converter. And so we had processed in a thing of about 3 tons of catalytic converter dust. And when we looked at the end result, our 1 kilogram that we had about 10% copper in it. And we were thinking, well, why are we having so much copper in this process? But your percentages confuse you sometimes, because then when you go back and you look at it and you look at what the actual, it was like 300 grams, a small amount of grams of material of copper, which was just contaminant. But the process loved it. So it took every piece of that and made it all the way through. And it looks like a big portion, but it was a very small amount that was in the contaminant.
Interesting. Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't know, like it reminds me kind of a little bit of marketing in some respects. It's not an exact science, you know, like the science is exact, but the way that the reaction plays out, there's an interdependency, there's a bit of maybe some kind of chemical game theory going on, you know, where there's things that are interacting with each other and causing other unknown side effects. Fascinating stuff. Do you feel like you've skilled up a little bit more on all the chemistry? Have you had to lead this type of organization?
Yeah, I have become a lot more in tune with the periodic table than I ever was in the past.
It's just another form of accounting, the way I see it.
Well, that's the part I laugh with the guys and the scientists, is that I get them to show me the chemical reactions on the writing out of it for me to understand, because it's math. In the simplest form, it's math. And when they can show me the reactions laid out, I can follow the math, which allows me to understand it a lot more than just trying to understand what it is.
Yeah. I think that's that. I definitely can empathize with that. So just coming back to kind of where you're at now and where this is all going, because precious metals is kind of, as we said right up front, quite a big market in a broad term. And you've quite narrowed in on North America catalytic converters, which in and of itself is a $20 billion market. Just help me understand, like, where to from here. Like, what's the near term and then what's the kind of medium term?
So right now we have module 1 of our facility coming online. We have some hiccups and up and down, but we're pushing forward and we should be producing quite well off of that one, which is designed to do about 5,000 pounds a day of catalytic converters. And so the plan then is the next step is that we'd like to move from 1 module to 4 modules in our current facility. So which would get us up to the 10 ton a day range. Mm-hmm. Then it's saying, okay, do you look expansion geographically? Because one of the costs is transportation. So can you set up locations on the West Coast area to get that sort of market where we currently have the East Coast market? Then it would be sort of, okay, is there international opportunities? And those ones we'd probably look at as partnerships or licensees, those types of things, because, trying to enter in new markets that you don't know all the cultural and legal parts, you kind of want a partner to do that.
Yeah. And like you kind of put some numbers on this again in the imperial system, but so and then sorry to be converting, but so I wanted to kind of move from, you had, let's say you got 10,000 pounds of catalytic converters a day. I think that's what you said. 10 tons is where you kind of want to get to.
Where we want to go to, yes.
Yeah, so 10 tons, just because the round number makes it easy to work through, converts into a certain amount of actually processed, available, recycled material, which has a dollar value of what? Like, help me understand economics from weight.
So I'll dance a little here. Because we're a public company, we have to watch what we give on metrics of numbers like that, because we haven't done it in the past. So it looks like us being promotional. So we always have to watch how we say metrics in that. But what we're generally looking at is we've said some numbers that could be 25 million annually for a plant of 10 tons a day.
Yep. Okay, cool. I guess the thing I'm trying to understand is like the scale of the operation at a single kind of unit. If you take the 10 ton a day option, that feels like a single unit of Regenexx. And so if you go, right, we can put one of these plants in, it does 10 tons a day, it generates, just purely mathematically, if you can put 10 tons in a day and the current price of palladium's X, and we can produce this outcome, then the value of the palladium is 25 million a year. Obviously, we know not clear yet on what the profit might be and all those other things, totally fine. And that, like, the only reason I say it is if you're looking at a $20 billion opportunity and you've got a plant generating 25 million a year worth of palladium, there's going to be hundreds of these things, or they're going to need to be hundreds times bigger.
Well, sorry, the 25 million we had in the range of the 5,000 pounds.
Got it.
Sort of your 4 is $100 million type thing. So, and the valuation of what we're paying, what you're doing, the 20 billion isn't North America. That's worldwide.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a piece in there is smelters aren't also going away in the long term. So we're not looking to capture the biggest piece of this. We're a niche and we think we can grow and we can keep growing at those levels. And that's where we see, but there's potentials for lots of this type things. And even when we say the 4, it isn't that we can or just limit to that. The facility can get bigger because of each of those modules. The 4 is where we designed as saying these are attainable goals of where we can move to in the near term.
Yeah, and we've talked a couple of times today, but also even before coming on about this idea of being at an inflection point, and you kind of look at this 10 ton a day plant as kind of, it's clearly out into scaling phase rather than commercialization phase. And for now, it's working out how to get from the 5,001 that you're tinkering with at the moment, probably too light a word, I don't mean to diminish it obviously, but dialing it in to the 10,001 a day, which then means you're in commercial scale. And now it's like, how many of these things do we need or how big do we make them?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're looking at.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, we have a track record of catching things as a show just when they're at that inflection point. So I have a small amount of confidence that we're going to have revisit this chat in a year or two's time, and you'll be like, Vince, we're well through that inflection point. It's happened about a dozen times on this show over the last 4 years.
Well, we're going to look at you as our charm then.
We would love to be that. I have one more question before we go, because we have focused on catalytic converters. We have talked about precious metals, but right up front, I did talk about critical minerals because they are such a big focus. They get a lot of press, all right? I think because a lot of the supply sides with China and a lot of the infrastructure makes them hard to get, and they're only in a few separate places. Is conceptually what you're doing here potentially applicable to the recycle and recovery of those types of minerals as well?
So platinum is one of the minerals designated a critical mineral for energy by the US government. So what we are doing falls into that piece. And partly is because, well, you mentioned China. Well, Russia's the other piece on that goes in. But the other piece, and I mentioned it earlier, is that right now catalytic converters are the primary usage, the biggest usage. But what's projected, especially for platinum, is that fuel cells need platinum or want platinum for their anodes. So the hydrogen fuel cells, all those pieces where there's two streams of the future of transportation, really. It's the battery, the lithium ion battery, or I may have said that one wrong, but
yep. Whichever battery's going to come in. Yep.
Yeah. Or fuel cells. And fuel cells are the ones that are getting a lot more play lately. And they're a critical place that platinum is for. And when we look at critical minerals, almost every place that platinum can be used, palladium can be used as a substitute. So if there's excess growth in platinum areas, quickly palladium's going to come into that to be a secondary source for it.
Yeah.
And so most times they play with platinum and palladium on who's cheaper. and then I use which one's cheaper in that time frame.
Well, it depends where you're getting it from, I guess. If you're getting it from catalytic converters in a very efficient process, then it sounds like some interesting competitive advantage. Just, I'd normally finish right there, but I actually am quite curious about why platinum is useful in a fuel cell if it's going to oxidize but also be quite conductive. What's happening there?
Well, so it's used as the anode. So the piece to transfer the electricity between
out of the solution or whatever.
Yeah, in the cell itself. So
got it.
The part that it's being used as.
Yeah, useful, fascinating. Oh my God! Every time we have a chat that involves some chemistry, we've only had about 4 or 5 of them on the show. I'm always like, "Tell me more." I go back to my kind of year 7 days where we were learning about this stuff at first principles. Don, it was an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Really, really excited for what you guys are doing, and I do have a sense that you're at this inflection point. I love the story. I'm from Perth, where about a quarter of the companies that list on the ASX in Australia, a quarter of them are from WA, and they're junior miners typically. Like this is kind of the tryout thing. So I'm very familiar with the space. To see a company go from junior explorer and junior miner to actually playing on the other side of the ledger with technology and actual displacing mining rather than just being a tech company, which is often what they do, it's fascinating and really interesting for me personally as well. So thank you for coming on the show.
Sure. I'll just give a little plug out to you. Said the ASC. We're traded in Canada as RGX on the Canadian exchange, and traded in the US as RGX TF. So, and if you look for more information, we're regenx.tech.
Wonderful. We'll have all the links to it in the show as well. So, yeah, look forward to checking back in a year or so and seeing the £10,000 a day payment.
That's what we look forward to too.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.